Hello. Welcome. It is so great to see you all. What a fantastic crowd. I got to see a number of you last year, so it's a treat to see you again this year. And I want to offer my special welcome to the class of 1974 to add to Tenny's welcome. Let's give them another round of applause. It's nice to be the youngest in the room, right? Yeah. Okay. So before I talk about the latest happenings here at Haas, I want to have a little fun. Reunions are supposed to be fun, right? Okay. And I'm going to need your full participation, and this requires turning on your Students Always orientation. And we're going to kind of return to school. So I want to think about what was happening in 1974 globally. And here are a couple of highlights and maybe some lowlights. So one, President Nixon resigned from office after the Watergate scandal in 1974. And no matter what your political affiliation was, this was like a huge deal at the time. It stunned Americans and people around the world. Muhammad Ali won the Rumble in the Jungle, knocking out heavyweight George Foreman in 1974. Godfather 2 hit theaters. I thought it was at least as good, well, maybe not quite as good as Godfather 1, but definitely better than Godfather 3. So that happened. And how could we ever forget the very public breakup of Sonny and Cher? That happened. Do you remember where you were when Sonny and Cher broke up? Maybe you do. No matter what was going on in the world, one thing that continues to bring people together and brought people together then is music. So let's take a little walk down 1974 music lane. And what we're going to do is we're going to play a short segment of a couple of songs that we co-curated. I actually had some input here because I didn't recognize some of the ones that you suggested, so I added my own. And I'd like you to just guess out loud who the artists are here. So here's the first one. This was not my pick, so. Yeah, ABBA, Waterloo. Okay, ABBA's Waterloo came out in 1974. Okay, so here comes one of my picks. Okay, ready? Get ready for it. I'm gonna swallow my pride. I'm gonna beg you to please. Baby, please sing. Who is it? Aretha. I'm gonna walk by myself just to prove that. Until you come back to me. That's good. Very good. You can't think about the 1970s without Aretha. Come on. Okay, here goes the third one.
The ladder to the stars, you climb on every rung, and there you stay.
I wouldn't have known this either. Bob Dylan, there you go. That's Forever Young, Bob Dylan. Like, who knew, right? Okay. And let's bring it home with one of my picks here.
Spending my day.
Okay. This was Al Green, I'm Still in Love with You. You all get an A for the day, for sure. That was very, very good. Nicely done. Okay, so as Tenny mentioned, I am a proud double bear, and I just recently counted up, and my family, including my father, who was a professor here for 30 years before I started, my sisters, who all have degrees here, and my mother, who has a teaching credential from here, we have 99 combined years at UC Berkeley. Okay. And we're actually never going to hit 100. We're going to leapfrog over 100 because my daughter is a graduate student now. So this next year that passes is going to count as 2 years. We're going to go to 101 right away. So anyway. I earned, as Tenny said, I earned my BA in psychology, my PhD in business. I taught at wonderful business schools. My first job was at Kellogg at Northwestern, which was #1 in the rankings all 6 years that I was there. I was at Harvard for a year. These are 2 illustrious schools. But when Berkeley called me, I came running back because there is no place like Berkeley. The excellence in teaching, in research, the sense of serving something larger than yourself, the community, these are unparalleled, I think, across academia. And even though we hadn't named them yet, we were already operating with our defining leadership principles. Our DLPs, which you may have seen when you walked in past the Kronk Arch, were guiding us even then. So like you, I treasure the memories, the professional connections, the friendships that I've made at Cal. This campus has been everything to me. And so in preparation for the reunion, I actually read your class notes, which were fascinating. Thank you so much for contributing them. And for contributing them over the years to the Haas magazine. So if I had to describe the alumni in this room, there are a few words that I would use to summarize what I read. It would be tenacious, fearless, entrepreneurial, boundary pushing, trailblazing, and most of all, altruistic. Berkeley Haas gave you all the confidence to take smart risks, to question the status quo, one of our DLPs. And you positively changed your lives and had a positive impact on others as well, going beyond yourselves to make a huge difference in the world. And Haassies like you are, in my humble opinion, a special breed, remaining students always, showing a level of humility that is in short supply in this world, doing things with an elegance, with a confidence without attitude, which to me, and I study leadership, is one of the most admirable traits of leadership that you can find. So you all set the bar high for yourselves and for all of the generations of Haas students who came after you. And for that, I am sincerely grateful. Thank you. So we're approaching another watershed moment here at Haas in our history. We recently welcomed our first entering class of our inaugural Speaker 4-year undergraduate program. The students come to us now as freshmen. They are little babies, and they are full of energy and enthusiasm. You can't even imagine. At least 10 of them have been in my office already. The semester just started in August. 10 of them have been in my office pitching business ideas, and 5 of them are really good, right? These students are going to have 4 years versus the standard 2-year program, for those of you who were undergraduates with us, for deep learning and enrichment. They'll still take their breadth courses around campus, but we're going to offer a wide range of co-curricular activities and a chance for them to really congeal as a cohort and get some benefit by identifying as business students earlier. We're so excited about this program. We also welcomed our newest MBA program, which is a joint venture between the Haas School and the College of Natural Resources. It's called the MBA Masters in Climate Solutions program. 11 new students who I think are going to solve climate change, right? They are unbelievable, and so we're really excited about that program. We also expanded our Flex MBA for evening and weekend students. We see that students want more flexibility. This is a very, very popular program now. The students take their core classes remotely, but synchronously in our new Forum labs. And then they come to campus once a year to be together as a cohort, and they're welcome to take either online or on-campus electives throughout their courses. We're attracting students well beyond California, and we're now seeing that many campuses are copying this model. And this week, we're opening up our Entrepreneurship Hub, which will make entrepreneurship more accessible, not just to Haas students, but to the entire campus. It is a brilliant, beautiful building, a Julia Morgan building that we modernized. We almost have the final permit. We're just waiting for the elevator permit to come through. And it's going to be the place for students from across campus to connect and build their entrepreneurial ideas. These programs are game changers for us. They perfectly align with Chancellor Lyons' mission to make Berkeley the university of choice for faculty, staff, and students who want to make an impact. They represent our commitment to access and excellence, which no one does that intersection better at scale than UC Berkeley. I can go on about the latest initiatives. There's even more going on than that, but the bottom line is that none of this would be possible without generous donors like you. In our previous fiscal year, the Haas School raised $33 million from more than 4,000 donors, of which 85% were alumni donors. Of course, we compete with the other business schools, most of which have very deep pockets. Their financial endowments can be 5, even 10 times what our endowment is. And we compete with them for faculty, staff, and students. And what this means is that donations of any size from alumni like you help keep the school competitive. Last year, we awarded more than 500 scholarships to deserving students thanks to your philanthropic support. For this, I share my deepest gratitude. Thank you to those of you who have stayed connected to Haas, donating to the Haas Annual Fund, to scholarships, to faculty support. Thank you to those of you who have included UC Berkeley in your estate plans. The impact of your generosity is absolutely profound. Can you tell that I'm just a little excited about the future at Haas? I hope that you are too. Together, we're ensuring that Haas will be around inspiring innovation leaders for another 126 years. Thank you, and go Bears. Yeah. I have time for some questions, if you all have anything that you'd like to know. Questions.
I have a question. Could you explain the background and the circumstances and the reason for the celebration of the Haas School on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange last week?
Wasn't that lovely? Did you see it? Yeah. Can you tell me your name, please?
Richard George.
Richard, thank you for that question. So, Howie, you can back me up on this, but we actually have an alum of the Haas School who works for the stock exchange, and she thought that this would be a lovely opportunity for Chancellor Lyons to ring the closing bell on the stock exchange. So she arranged for it to happen. It wasn't exclusively Haas, but I'll say Haas was pretty well represented. So our advisory board chair, Elena Gomez, who's the CFO at Toast, flew out and was on a panel with Chancellor Lyons. And I heard that there was it 150? Were those just Haas folks or everybody? Yeah, but it was a lot of Haas. I would guess that half of that were Haas connections. So that was the background, and it was a beautiful thing. We had just been out in New York the week before, and I was so tempted to fly back because I've never experienced that before, but it was really a beautiful thing. Yeah, thank you.
We have time for one more.
David Eccles. I just want to complement the university, and what you're talking about is the expansion of the programs into ecology and climate change and whatever. There's such diverse opinion on that, and some place needs to take a lead. And Cal has been a leader on a lot of things, and I'm really happy to hear that has become a focus, because someone around, and I'm glad it's Cal, is taking up that mantra.
Yeah, thank you for that. At Haas, thank you. We feel very strongly about sustainability, broadly speaking. We just hired our Chief Sustainability Officer. We have an Office of Sustainability. Our goal is for every single one of our students to be a sustainability fluent leader. So even if you're not in our joint program, you will have knowledge and expertise about how to grapple with these very, very challenging, complicated problems. So our faculty have embedded sustainability across fields in accounting, in finance, in marketing. They use cases that are focused on sustainability challenges. They bring in speakers who have expertise in sustainability. It is something we're really focused on. So thank you for that validation. I appreciate it. Okay, listen. You don't want to talk to me anymore because John Kolstad is here, and he's really great. So let me introduce him, and I'm really thrilled that John could be here today. Professor Kolstad is the Henry J. Kaiser Chair and Faculty Director of the Center for Healthcare Marketplace Innovation. This center is another initiative that has been created through transformational philanthropy. John was one of the go-to people for health analytics during the pandemic. So he's really an expert, and I can't wait to hear what he has to share with us. Please help me in welcoming John Kolstad.
Thank you, Jenny. All right, my mic's working. Sounds great. Good to meet many people, see familiar faces. Very excited to be here. I'll wait till I get my slides up and running. All right. Well, I can see it. My confidence monitor is working, but all right, there we go. All right. No, I'm excited to be able to speak. It's always fun. I think healthcare with people of a certain age becomes particularly relevant. So I'm excited that I have an audience. When I can talk about Medicare, there's actually going to be enthusiasm, practical realities. So let me tell you the undergrad version of this. It's interesting, but they call it sort of hypothetical policy. It's not practical. So what I'm going to attempt to do, and almost certainly fall short because there's just so many things here, but really start to think about a lot of my research and applications, what we're doing at my center, thinking about the confluence of human decision-making, human actions, and AI in the future of our healthcare system. And that's both intrinsically interesting because health is incredibly important. I will convince you of that beyond probably what you understand yourself. Maybe you already know. But also because this is lending new insights into broader questions in behavioral economics, broader questions in computer science, where you have to take seriously a lot more of the nuance than, say, just training a language model on everything on the internet. There's some music to it. So I will add, and I'm going to leave briefly. We're very lucky. I convinced him. My phenomenal PhD student, Jonas Knecht, is going to actually come up for part of this talk, as he is really driving a really new approach to generative AI, and it's a great opportunity to have him introduce it. So before I get going on the kind of details, I just want to paint a little bit of a picture, which is obviously health is near and dear to people in their own lives, but just to put in perspective how much it matters for the U.S. And this is basically the growth rate and levels of healthcare as a percentage of GDP in the U.S. compared to comparable countries. What does that mean? Similar income, actually better life expectancy typically, et cetera. And so what you can see is that healthcare at this point is approaching 20% of GDP in the U.S. And that this gap alone, so that's a high level, but if we think about this gap alone, if we were to, say, address even half of that, in principle, that would be about 3 percentage points of GDP. We could eliminate poverty in principle, just on the half of the gap between the U.S. and other healthcare systems. Okay? It doesn't mean we're not getting a lot of value. It doesn't mean this is per se wrong, but I want to put in perspective the stakes that we're dealing with when we start talking about both health policy, the way the healthcare system works, and then what AI might do. Over here, for the interested party, it's a little bit in the weeds, but I also want to note, where is this coming from and where are the big opportunities? Well, one is this big blue bar, which is basically inpatient and outpatient care. That's the care you're getting. But another thing I want to draw your attention to first is this green bar, where twice as much administrative spending, okay? And that's a really interesting opportunity. We're not talking about saying, you get heart surgery and you don't get heart surgery. We're just saying, let's make it more efficient and effective to operate in the system. So I think there are things where we think AI is already moving without getting into the clinical care, where there's tremendous amounts. Okay? And there are estimates that up to a quarter of healthcare spending is actually in that administrative domain, and so this could be a large opportunity. So with that as a backdrop, let me tell you where I'm going to attempt to go over the course of this talk. First, I want to talk about health insurance choice. And as I said, I'm excited to talk Medicare with an interested audience, but I think it's very important because insurance actually matters for the entirety of the healthcare system. And in addition to that, insurance and the insurance choice turns out to be, as many of you are experiencing right now, a very complicated decision, actually a place where we can think of early or optimal AI kind of being deployed. Then I want to think a little bit more about a new project we're working on, bringing behavioral economics to the understanding of clinical decision making. And we're going to actually use really, really granular data from the emergency department of the UCSF to understand specific decisions made by doctors in trying to diagnose care. Then lastly, we're going to move to, our view, I should say, not my view, of basically building on that research agenda. What we're building is a completely new approach to generative AI that is designed for healthcare and that we believe is a much bigger leap for healthcare than, say, large language models in the application. And then lastly, I will say I love Q&A throughout. It's a little difficult to do, but if you have a question, please raise your hand. Economists tend to interrupt all the time, so I get kind of uncomfortable if I'm talking too much out of interruption. And if we start butting up against time, I'll let everyone know. But until that point, please interrupt, and then we'll have a little time for Q&A at the end. Okay. So AI in healthcare. AI is too broad for one talk. That is understatement of the year. And AI in health is still way too broad. I'm going to give it a try. But I want to be clear, artificial intelligence broadly construed is going to be transformational to the healthcare system. Think about just the better science side. AlphaFold, the ability to propose new proteins and to do that kind of synthesis dramatically fast. It's going to transform science. Better medicine. We'll talk a little bit about this today, but think about predictive analytics, decision support, personalization, knowing who needs what when, and being at the vanguard of the universe of clinical knowledge. That's going to change the way healthcare is delivered. As I said, targeting. And then lastly, think about productivity. Simple things like instant adjudication and prior authorization, chatbots that are really actually clinically knowledgeable. We're a little ways out from that, but think about that's going to transform who and when you can access care. It's going to be, I think, a very, very big deal. There's estimates, we can put dollars on it, right? There's a reasonable estimate of reduced costs simply from deployment of AI technologies we already know about, $200 to $360 billion a year within 5 to 10 years. Right, so that's real money, and so that's exciting. But what is AI? What am I talking about? Yes.
Everybody's excited about AI, from the investment people on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley, and people are making lots of money in AI. I dread AI as it is today, even more looking out there at generative AI. I am a practicing psychologist, and including Kaiser likes to manualize diagnostic procedures and simplify the decision-making and steer people towards medication. That's not what I do, and that's not what I'm looking for. And I hope that your program that you're describing here isn't going to be too fast out of the chute.
Yeah. So no, completely. And actually, you're gonna enjoy the well, I hope the whole talk, but certainly the latter third. Really, this gets to the heart of why we're doing things differently. So I can potentially play a computer scientist on TV if I need to. We have partners, that are doing the computation side. But what do we bring that's different by starting as economists and behavioral economists thinking about information flow, the realities of decision making, the nuance and complexity of these choices? You end up with a very different view of what a future of medical AI would look like. It's capturing the nuance of the realities of the clinical practice, the fact that there are different styles and approaches, and that there is not cookie-cutter medicine. So at the end, what we'll show you is our approach, frankly, to do exactly what you said, which is you should not have one size fits all. We know enough that this person has to get this medication. And right now, even without AI, I would argue that's really where we're going. That what is high quality medicine? It is what one clinical society said should be done off one clinical trial that was often done, or ideally a clinical trial. We want to have a much more nuanced view. But stay tuned. I think you'll be interested in this. Okay. But before we get into the medicine delivery, I want to talk a little bit about health insurance choice as a policy issue, a practical issue, and a laboratory. I've done a lot of work in health insurance choice for about 10 years now. It really has become kind of the vanguard of an area to study behavioral economics, going back to the passage of Medicare Part D, the prescription drug plans in 2006. Anyone who's had to deal with that knows how incredibly complex it is to choose amongst 40 to 50 different options before we even add in the other ones. So this question is sort of precisely how, if you asked a behavioral economist, what is the worst way to design a market, you'd kind of end up with that. And so we're thinking about that as something that we might want to study, and something in particular that AI broadly can help us with. And actually, before that, I realized I jumped over because I had this excellent question. What is AI? Let me be clear about what I'm going to, or at least as clear as I can, about how I'm going to think about AI. I'm going to have a very inclusive view that AI is just the ability of a machine to take some data and to predict something that's going to happen. And it turns out, many of you may remember regressions or views regressions. That's AI in this view. And we can talk about how precisely it's going to predict. That also opens up all the way through to, as we'll see, the most cutting-edge generative models still have that basic core. But you want to be thinking about prediction problems as AI. Okay? It's not some sort of amorphous robot doing all of these things. It's simply, if we have the right data, we have some X's over here and we have a Y over here to go back to school here, and we want to predict what's going on. So that's going to be at the core of what we're thinking about, just to sort of frame the idea. And here we want to think about that in insurance. And so currently today, I know how many of you have made a Medicare choice? Open enrollment ends Saturday. A lot. Hopefully many of you are about to. I'll have a pitch at the end of it. But often, and really traditionally, we've relied on agents, and we might call them skilled experts. At least we want to think about this, that there's a broker that's supposed to help you with this decision. There's actually, until we did this study, there really wasn't very much known about how effective they were. And in fact, I'm going to try to show you that the computational process of figuring out the right insurance product is actually infeasible for a human. So you shouldn't rely too much. I mean, it can be feasible if you're simple enough. It's a simple enough situation. But really what we want to think about is, could the tools that we have actually provide a personalized recommendation that would match you to your plan given your actual health needs, and not just your health needs today, right? You don't buy insurance for the world of today. You buy insurance against what might befall you. But what's the distribution of that? Right? What's the chance you have an ailment? And if that ailment happens, where would you go for care and how much would that cost? That's actually very, very difficult at best to figure out. And so we're going to think about this and actually build a tool, which I did a long time ago now, and look at the deployment of it in a setting where you have skilled experts and ask how AI interacts or substitutes for these skilled experts trying to actually match people to plans. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go over this kind of quickly. This is basically this idea. This comes from a separate paper, but thinking about what's the value of insurance. Well, you need to be forward-looking about what's the chance you're going to spend a lot? What's the chance you're going to spend a little? On this upper panel is basically how much you'd spend all year. And this on the left hand, and then the y-axis here is the relative value, in this case from a different paper, of just 2 plan choices. So about as simple as it's going to get. And essentially the idea is that if you think you're going to spend this much, then it's a much better deal to do the high deductible health plan, and then there's this break even. But this idea that you have to be forward looking. Now what's interesting in that setting, which I want to use to motivate this, is that looking forward, with all the details, 70% of people at this firm would have been better off in the high deductible plan. And this is one of the highest income, highest education, top firms in the world. 70% of people, if they'd been able to do the math, would have been better off. Practically 7% of people enrolled. Okay? And when we went and looked at this, we actually administered a really detailed survey, but basically it wasn't, there's lots of survey design. It was pretty simple in some sense. We asked people to simply answer questions about the different options. And it turns out when you get that information, you see a massive level of misinformation, again, including amongst these people who are very highly incentivized, highly educated. People can't, for example, in this case, the plans were exactly the same. So for those of you from Washington State, Premier Blue Cross, it was basically exactly the same. Yet people, very few were able to answer that they had the same network. And in fact, people that thought the network was different were paying on average $2,300 a year to access that network, right? So this gets to this idea that in lots of different settings, even much simpler than Medicare, people are making choice errors. So what might we do about this? We want to, and actually, before I get to there's another example of this in, and I want to actually dwell on this a moment because we're going to use this test later, which is a simple test is that you should treat, right? Those of you who aren't buying insurance at the moment, right? What do you get when you buy insurance? You pay a premium, and then you have some amount of cost sharing, right? And those $1 of premium and $1 of cost sharing, you should think about it exactly the same way. $1 is $1 is $1. And so one of the first studies by Jason Abelak and John Gruber showed that, in fact, when you looked at Medicare Part D, right, so the prescription drug plans, people treated $1 of out-of-pocket. If you said, look, what is $1 of premium? An out-of-pocket dollar was treated like 20 cents. So they're wildly overweighting the premium component. Now, what happened, many of you may have seen this, right? You end up with $0 premium plans that then have very high cost sharing, right? Firms are saying, well, if people aren't figuring out what's going on, that's an easy way to get a lot of enrollment. And once you show up and your drugs aren't covered. So this again, it's one of these examples to motivate that what would an optimal decision maker do? They'd treat $1 like $1. And so we're going to ask, how could we actually solve this with a prediction problem with an AI tool? And so what you want to think about is your risk. I need to know how much I'm going to spend next year. I need to know how worried I am about really bad cases versus spending less than average. And then I might want to think about, for sure, which doctors do I have, my pharmacy, can I get a hold of someone? But its core is this prediction problem, that I want to understand if 100,000 people that look like me today went through all these different plans, what would what would they spend? Would they have coverage? Would they have their meds covered? That turns out not to be a good problem for humans. It's a fantastic problem for a computer. It's a fantastic problem for prediction, and that's what we built. We basically have a predictive model based on a limited number of easily inputted features. Namely, if you put your drugs in, we're going to tell you how much I expect you to spend in each one of these options, what the good case scenario is, what the bad case scenario is, and roll that into one score that's going to match you to a plan. And this AI recommendation was deployed as an API integration. So basically it was deployed into Aon Hewitt's Navigators Exchange, which we're going to study. Yes?
Are you going to integrate cost-plus drugs into this model? Because they advertise what their cost of the drug is, what their markup is, and what you can expect to pay outside. And that'll compare all the other Schedule D stuff. Because they're primarily generic rather than drug-specific.
Yeah, so you can easily integrate that. This occurs before that was there. We have partnered with, for example, because a lot of people have much lower site price generics, Costco, Walmart. So basically, you want to think of all of this being able to integrate with that. I love it. An audience is in the details of this. But yes, exactly. You could think about that as being integrated, but that's not going to be core here. This predates it. We're going to focus on Medicare Advantage enrollments. And to put in perspective, Aon served, for example, all AT&T retirees. This is a very big exchange, a very big approach to doing this. So here, and again, I don't have access to the interface anymore, so I can't get you a better version of this, so I apologize, it's a little bit fuzzy. But here's kind of what the interface looked like. And I'll show you a much more up-to-date interface that's actually direct-to-consumer later. But essentially, you're putting in your information and then your drugs, and what's popping back out is basically plans with, and again, it's very fuzzy, how much you'd expect to spend, and this score up here, right? Those little things are AI in this sense, but it allows brokers or anybody else to very quickly assess across the 40 to 50 different plan options for you individually what's going to be the lowest cost and best risk protection and best access to doctors for you, and then potentially narrow that down to a small number. Is there a question there? Yeah.
No, I would just say that's what I just went through with Medicare.gov, where you put in what your drugs are.
Yeah.
And at least for me, the biggest difference is you can't predict at this age what your health is going to be next year.
Right.
And for me, I had to make choices last year because of some stage, class 4 drugs that were offered that were not really covered. And so there's a big shift.
Huge swings, and I will show you at the end. So we, for years, tried to get Medicare, but under all of the different parties to try to do more on this, and there was not an interest in doing it. Because Medicare basically it's a calculator right now. It's not forward-looking. It doesn't have, well, I know I take these drugs, but what might I add? And if I add, what's the bad scenario? I will add that it's much worse this year because in the IRA, there's a cap on the out-of-pocket spending, which the insurers have to cover. So what's happened is that there's less exposure, but premiums have gone way up, and they've started dropping drugs because they don't have to cover drugs that are never covered at all.
And most people do not realize that $2,000 cap, if your drug is not covered under your...
It doesn't apply.
Then you don't get
Yeah.
to put it in that bucket.
Exactly. So I will show you this at the end. We've deployed this algorithm with part of what my center does is actually launch out solutions into the market. So Health Pilot actually does this. And it's very interesting this year. You can see it exactly this, that when you compute, I want to add in, say, a drug that's not at all on formulary, you'll go from, I expect to spend $2,000 max to $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 because of this dropping phenomenon. Let's come back to that. Okay, so this is the kind of initial phase we're interested in. Oh, yes, there's a question. Yeah.
It seems to me that AI should very soon be able to diagnose serious health problems for 90% of health problems. Are we on that path?
I think we're a lot further from AI alone diagnosing serious health problems by itself. I think it will augment human decision making, and I want to come back to that in a second. Yeah. But it will play a central role in improving diagnostic decision making. And in fact, with that in mind, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I want to make sure to get to those other pieces of AI. We're covering a lot of ground. What we're going to study is the rollout of this AI algorithm to all these brokers beforehand. And I'll show you this again in a second. Basically, this is what the distribution of choice error looked like. So if you say, what are the mistakes that are being made depending on which agent I happen to get on the phone? First, you'll notice that there's a whole lot of people leaving a whole lot of money on the table, right? So the average person in the market is losing $1,300. Now, there's a few of them, about 12%, who are getting the right plan, but lots more out here. And what you may also see if you squint is that there's a wide distribution of the error you get depending on who you get on the phone. So to put this in perspective, going from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of the agents on the phone cost $800. So if you just randomly happen to get, Jenny as an agent who's really good, or randomly happen to get me who's much less competent, that gap, $800, simply by how skilled we are at actually doing this beforehand. So there's real variation in these supposedly skilled experts that are supposed to help you. And then the question becomes, could AI actually reduce that gap? What I will show you also is that this is the distribution of choice error. You can see that they spend the same amount of time on the phone. They have the same level of experience. They have the same age, gender, and prescription drug coverage. So what we're using is we found a nice natural experiment that who answers the phone is random. But what we're also seeing is that the really skilled agents, the ones that are doing the best, that have only an error of $900, they don't look any different. Right? I can't figure out, oh, here's the really, they're really high performers. So maybe there's something intrinsic about humans being very unable to do this. And so what we can look at is, and I'll just draw your attention. This is the actual distribution of choice error, this blue line, and then the 2015 choice error before AI was available. What you can see is that everything is shifting out. And so what we can show in the paper is that by introducing this AI tool to these people that do this professionally, the average person saved $300 very, very conservatively. And that ignores the value of increased, having access to your drugs, access to your doctor, et cetera. Simply the dollars on the table. That's $7 billion in Medicare Advantage alone, just from that access level. But what you can also see that's pretty interesting is how it happened. So you may recall, I went over it quickly, the kind of ratio of out-of-pocket spending to cost the premium is a sign of bad decision-making. And so if I look at the agents that are making the worst choices beforehand, they're assigning a weight to that premium relative to everything else that's about 17 times larger. So they're essentially just saying, just look at the premium, it doesn't matter what's covered. Now the highest skilled folks are doing a better job, but it's still about 2. If we look at these same people, this is the same people after they were given the AI tool, it's completely flat. It goes to 1. So they're basically correcting this choice error, this classic behavioral economics choice error, simply by introducing the AI tools. And that's what's saving people tremendous amounts of money, and frankly, much more importantly, perhaps, giving them access to medications and prevention and things like that. Okay, so let me end with saying, if this is of interest to you, when I first did this work, no one could touch this unless you were behind the firewall of Aon or other exchanges using it. It is now available directly to consumers to basically provide, again, back to this point that we were trying to get Medicare to do this, and they, for whatever reason, have not been willing to. This is very much in the spirit of my center, which is take the science, build the tools, and actually deploy them. Which is a new role, frankly, to some extent, for universities in general, and Rich Lyons is leading the charge on this. So Health Pilot is a good example, and you can see it over here. This is actually how much you're going to spend the year over there, so it has that predictive element. Okay, so how much? What am I? I'm on till 15 minutes. 15 minutes, perfect. There's a clock over there. All right. Want to make sure to give Jonas sufficient time. So that's talking about a very simple, but I would argue very important. It's not the glamorous side of healthcare, but we all know that it matters. It matters for coverage, right? You can think about all these people. We have all these efforts to get you to take your medications. If they're simply not covered and you can't afford it, forget calls and gels and glow caps and things like that. But now we want to think a little bit more about this question of diagnosis, this question of, well, where is AI going to actually get into the process of medical care? And this really comes out of a large set of projects that are joint between Berkeley and UCSF, thinking about the realities of clinical decision-making. So this gets to this question earlier, or look, this is not a cookie-cutter thing. I don't think, does Sam Altman understand medicine? Not totally clear. I don't know what it is. But this is from the National Academy of Medicine. So this is their effort. They thought diagnosis was sufficiently important to do an entire multi-year study of the process of diagnosis. And essentially this, the colorful part in the middle is what matters. But this idea that clinical decision-making is not a decision tree that everyone knows. It is a process of trial and error and learning in highly complex, very personal, and very specific environment. And that means you have clinical history, you have the physical exam, you have diagnostic testing. All of these things are happening, and they're happening in a loop where there's learning. And the reality is that most doctors today are doing this with essentially no feedback. They're expected to make decisions based on complex clinical probabilities, and there's this constantly evolving medical knowledge. So how could we think about building AI to be much more effective at learning this critical process, and how human do we think that process is? And that's really the focus we're going to have today. And this is, I think, just an example of why we think this is really important. There's a nice piece by Atul, there's many nice pieces, but by Atul Gawande basically arguing a very related point, which is, we have coaches for CEOs, we have lots of feedback. Doctors are making these very high stakes decisions, have almost no feedback on whether or not it was a good one. Imagine UCSF, my wife's a professor at UCSF, she gets incredibly complicated cases sent to her, she sees them, they return from whence they came. Those patients, sometimes she gets feedback, but the difference between an incredibly successful outcome where there was complete healing and the person went so poorly that they never returned, she doesn't have any visibility into that. And so that kind of thing is transformational. And so I've done some work in this. There are others basically arguing that the ability to learn from broader process of clinical practice is going to be really, really important to the clinical practice of the future. And we think that AI is going to be central to that. Okay? And to motivate that, I want to think about diagnostic testing. So this could have a bunch of Greek. I'm not going to do a bunch of Greek for you. But you can think about it at a very simple level. Well, what we really want to understand is what's going on inside a doctor's head. And that's pretty hard. But it turns out, given that we have these digital breadcrumbs that many of you have had received care recently know that an electronic health record, everything's being captured. So sort of uniquely to medicine for a high-skilled field, we actually measure the process of going through that wheel. We measure that process of, I think this is the particular diagnosis. I want to narrow it down. I'm going to try this test. And so what we can see is that basically think about just sort of this iterative testing. Suppose they did a first test. These are all the possible diagnoses. I narrow it down to this side. Then I do some little more effort. I narrow it down to here. This doctor did a lot of thinking because they got to this very precise final test. There's only 2 options. And so when I see them test for this, I actually have a measure of this whole process of the thinking beforehand. Okay? And that's going to be the core of what we're going to think about in the context of the UCSF emergency department. This is the UCSF version of that. It's a less colorful version of the same thing. But you can think about patients coming into the emergency department. They're assigned randomly to doctors, which is going to be important for our purposes. And then they're going to basically, what's the name of the game in an emergency room? Diagnosis and triage. So they're entirely focused on figuring out what someone has as quickly as possible and getting into the right treatment. And we're going to study that process, doing some tests, getting some results. You either reject it or it confirms your hypothesis, and then you decide whether to admit them to the hospital. Okay? And what we're going to look at is the role played by cognitive load in that. And the key idea here is that if a doctor has to think about more other complex decisions at the same time, that might change the way they actually do their thinking about a particular patient. And that, if that matters, that's a very different view of, my doctor always does the same thing and it's just about, they do too much because they're paid too much, or they do, it's a very different view. And so what we're going to ask is, if there are more other patients that have complicated decisions to make, how does it affect my care? And these are those cognitive load measures. All of these lines are every shift in the emergency department of UCSF over a 3-year period. Now, I don't expect you to make sense of those gray lines, but that tells you, some people start with a bunch of really complicated patients, then it got a lot harder for them, and then it got a little easier. This is the mean over the shift, but also the interquartile range. So for the 4th hour of a shift, you could have a much easier shift where you're not thinking about a lot of other things, or you could have a really complicated one. And in principle, you don't think that that's going to affect your care. But what we're going to find, in fact, is that higher cognitive load dramatically increases the use of tests. Essentially, they're ordering more tests to accomplish the same outcome, and it's because they're less precise. So for those of you who remember information theory, this is that the Shannon entropy is higher. But put simply, they're ordering a whole battery of tests that are not as targeted on what the actual conditions they ultimately might have are. And that means, at a very simple level, for example, if you took this cognitive load idea into account, we show that if you just simply redesigned the UCSF dispatch algorithm, you could actually reduce the need for diagnostic tests by 23%. These are very big shifts simply by taking seriously the fact that doctors are humans too, right? They're not always, I'm sure none of you are, but, when I sit down to write, it depends on the time of day. It depends if I've just eaten lunch, for example. But the other thing that I think is really exciting is that AI actually opens up these tools. That perhaps I don't think that an AI that is generated for the average doctor should help me. But what about an AI that says, hey, John, if you'd given that talk before you ate dessert, you would have done things a lot differently and your audience would have been much more engaged, for example. Or as a doctor, yeah, exactly. I left half the dessert, so it could have been 50% better. So I think this is what really opens up the idea that taking seriously the human element, but also using that to build the AI of the future. And so let me turn it over to Jonas now and I'll come back in a second, but to think about what is generative AI and how might it be deployed in medicine.
I have 5 minutes.
Yes,
I have 5 minutes, all right. All right, hello everyone. All right, my name is Jonas Knecht. I'm one of his PhD students. I work sort of on the confluence of computer science, behavioral science, and all of it sort of applied to clinical decision making. So my PhD, my work relates exactly to actually the first question we got here. How do you tell an AI, how do you get an AI to understand the sort of real life nuances of treating patients? Now I only have 5 minutes. So I'm not going to be able to go through everything. I'll try to sort of go through the most important parts. So the first thing I want to start out with is a general overview of sort of what is a large language model. This is sort of the newest piece of technology everyone's very excited about. And to highlight the fact that these models are quite powerful, I asked this question a few days ago, who won the big game in 2024 between Cal and Stanford? This is the sort of question you might want to ask an AI, a large language model, especially if you're in this audience. And as you can see, the answer that it gave us is both factually correct. It was an absolutely incredible dash towards the end of the game. But it's also factually correct, and it sounds like the kind of answer that a human might have produced, right? And so how do we get an AI, which is a sort of a computer system, to sound this human, to behave this human, and to have this sort of understanding of the real world? Well, I'm going to get into, again, sparring any of the Greek, I'm going to get a little bit into how these models learn, and I'm going to get into how we can leverage that to have it understand clinical decision-making as opposed to language, for example. So if you look at the sentence, which is the sentence I just set up there, the way a large language model would understand the sentence is as a sequence of tokens, right? You might ask, what is a token? Which is an entirely fair question. In the CS nomenclature, a token is sort of a single piece of information, right? In the language setting, a token is a word, a letter, a character, these sorts of things. In sentences, the sort of unit of observation that the model knows about are sequences of these tokens, right? You string a bunch of words together, you end up with a sentence. And the task that you train these models on, right? And training means sort of you have the model do a thing a lot, and after doing it a lot, it sort of learns something about the data that it's been looking at. The task you train these models on is actually very, very, very simple, which is I take some words in the sentence and I ask the model to predict the next word in the sentence, right? And if I do this enough, and I do this over quite literally trillions of potential combinations of words, I mean, these models are trained on sort of all of the web. It starts to get a really rich understanding of the relationship between different tokens, between different words, and some core understanding of how language works. And if the model sees these kinds of sentences enough, it knows that if I give it as an input here in blue, Cal beats, and I say, all right, what is the next word? Well, Cal beats Stanford, right? And if I put Stanford as the input and I say, all right, Cal beats Stanford, what should come next? The model will learn, if it's seen enough of these sentences, next will come a score, right? I've understood that if, X beat Y by some margin, and that's what's going to happen here. So language models are great. They have all this. They can learn language. What they struggle with is transferring knowledge to any domain in which language is not the primary mode of communicating and not the primary mode of sort of encoding information, right? And as John mentioned, in the clinical domain, language is not what you want to be learning your model on, right? What is captured in language in clinical settings is textbooks, right? We don't let physicians treat real patients after they've gone to medical school and read a bunch of textbooks because real-world patients don't look like the textbook cases. There are a ton of nuances this, and we have, in fact, a whole system of residency, right, to accustom physicians to the real-world complexities that they're facing. And so really what you want to do, if you want to build a model that understands clinical decision-making, is you want to train that model on the actual clinical decisions themselves, right? And so we can go to the UCSF ED, for example, and we can observe sort of the EHR, right, the sequence of clinical actions that take place for a patient, and we can try to sort of have a model understand these sequences, right? From a behavioral economics perspective, why is that powerful? Well, the perspective we take is that most clinical information lives in sort of the brain of the provider, right? These are incredibly highly skilled individuals who spent years and years and years sort of being exposed to the real-world complexities of treating patients. How do we get that information out? Where do we see that information represented? It is, again, not the textbook. It is in the actual actions that they take, right? If I'm a patient in the ED and my physician decides to place a particular test, why are they ordering that test, right? What is causing them to do that? It is all the clinical understanding they have about treating patients like me in the real world. And so we can try to hopefully sort of back that out of training a model on these action paths. And so the large language models are great. They're not super useful in this setting, but it turns out that, again, no Greek here, but the maths that makes large language models work also is sort of similar to the maths you'd need to make this kind of model work. And that's sort of a core aha moment, for me as sort of someone in the computer science field. Like, this was a super important idea that the same way that a sentence is a sequence of tokens, right? And by doing this fairly simple predictive task of give me the next word, right, and do this enough, you learn really, really complex relationships between different tokens in these sequences. You can extend that same logic to the sequence of clinical actions, right? And by switching what a token represents, you can change the sorts of things the model learns about. So what what our data is going to look like is not a sequence of words, but a sequence of clinical actions. What the model is going to learn to predict is not the next word in a sentence, but the next clinical action that a provider would have taken for a particular patient. And by doing that for millions of patients treated by hundreds of thousands of providers all around the United States, if you have a large enough amount of data, the model is going to pick up a really sort of deep understanding of the types of clinical care paths that are likely to take place that are relevant for a particular patient, right? And you get to the sort of, again, coming back to the first question we got, which is entirely reasonable, you're going to learn sort of the real life version of practicing medicine, not the textbook case, not the thing that sort of you might find online. And what we end up with is, on one hand, a really cool research agenda and a sort of nice PhD, because we're inventing a new model here. We get a model that is much more powerful in answering these kinds of questions, right? For example, what is the most informative test for a particular patient? Right? This is the sort of thing you might want to reasonably ask, have an AI help you out with if you're a physician treating patients. And you certainly don't want an AI that has only seen the textbook case, right? You want a model that understood, all right, this patient is a bit more complicated. This is sort of a rare thing. I might want to place this one test that in a textbook you wouldn't really find, right? You can also ask real life questions, right? If I've seen a lot of patients in emergency departments, I can start asking questions about how long do I think this particular patient will stay in the ED, right? This helps you sort of plan ahead your resource distribution, these sorts of things. So that's the approach we took. I'm going to show you what our data looks like. So this is there's a lot of information here. The main point I'm trying to make is, this is a real example from UCSF, right? This is the when I say sequence of tokens and sequence of clinical actions, this is what I'm talking about, right? So if you ever, ask a physician to explain a particular patient, what they'll say is like, female age 70 complaining of chest pain presents to the ED. Right? And what do? Well, we observe that in the first set of tests that they perform are things that would be consistent with sort of a chest pain workup, right? Like you're worried about a particular cardiac event, and so you're going to see a troponin test, for example, for a heart attack. You're going to see an EKG. You're also going to see a chest X-ray, right? Because a lot of patients that think they have heart attacks actually have pneumonia, and you want to sort of test for these things. So this is capturing all of this really, really, really rich knowledge that physicians have about how to treat patients like this. It's reflected in the actions that we observe them take. And what follows this sort of sequence of actions, what our model is going to learn is, if I'm at some point over here, I'm going to have the model learn to predict what happens next, right? And by doing that enough, again, it gets this really rich understanding of how medicine is practiced in the real world. This is my final slide, so I think I'm good on time. We've built this model at UCSF. We trained it on as many sort of encounters we could get, as many order paths, patient paths we could get. And then we sort of tried to see, all right, is this model smarter than a large language model, right? Like, can we evaluate this in some reasonable way? And so if you take this particular path, for example, this turns out to be, it looks like a textbook path in the beginning. It looks like a textbook heart attack 70-year-old patient. In fact, one of the comorbidities is high blood pressure. So like you really think, all right, this person might be, obesity. This person might be having a heart attack. And you see the first few actions sort of make sense here, right? A transthoracic echo, chest CT. And what we've done here is we've sort of asked two different models. One is our clinical LBM. LBM stands for large behavioral model. And so instead of a large language model, we've built a large behavioral model. And the other model in red, that choice of color is sort of not without reason. In red, we have the sort of, you mentioned Sam Altman earlier. This is Sam Altman's most favorite new model, GPT 4.0. And what we're going to ask these models to do is sort of reason along this clinical path, right? So we're going to give the model all this patient information, and we're going to say, what do you think should happen next? Like, what do you think is wrong with this patient? And if you give this to a language model versus a clinical large behavioral model, you see very different outcomes. Because right here, right where I have this sort of dashed box, something happens. Something sort of non-standard happens. This is not a textbook case anymore. These physicians start treating this patient for a potential stroke, right? Which is not the sort of thing you would have expected just by looking at the initial characteristics of this patient. And if you give this information to the large language model and you say, hey, what do you think is wrong with this patient? After the physicians have understood that this patient actually has a stroke rather than a heart attack, the large language model has no real diagnostic value in understanding those actions, right? The large language model goes back and says, well, you should do another 12-lead EKG, right? You should do another chest X-ray, another troponin test. It's stuck in the textbook understanding of how do I treat a patient like this. This is exactly the kind of large language model you don't want to let loose in the real world, because it's not able to capture the sort of real world sort of nuances of how to treat a patient that isn't exactly standard. Whereas if you take our large behavioral model, our clinical large behavioral model, and you ask it the same question, right? In green, this model totally understands that the moment I observe this action, right, this is something the physicians wouldn't do without reason, right? They're doing this because they're worried about a potential stroke. And the next set of actions that our model starts to predict are things like neurochecks, an MRI of the brain with some contrast. Everything sort of culminates in a stroke protocol. So like the main point here is, if you want a model that is clinically intelligent, you have to take your clinical intelligent individual really seriously. Where does that information live? It lives in actions, right? When you try to train a model on actions rather than words and language, everything changes and you're left with a much more powerful tool that can help real physicians in the real world treat real patients, which at the end of the day, is ideally what you want. And large language models, as sexy as they are right now, are not the technology that is going to transform this bit of healthcare. And that's a really important piece, and that's the end. I don't have a thank you slide. I don't know if you want to... But thank you. That was meant to be 10 minutes. Oh, yeah, sorry.
We have time for one question.
Yeah, any questions? I know this was a lot. Quickly.
Where does insurance play?
Sorry?
Where does insurance?
Well, so John mentioned a prediction task, right? Like you could imagine a much more granular model, right? So instead of, what has our large behavioral model learned? It has learned that if I'm at this point right here in my patient's care, right, this is what I think is going to happen to this patient in the future. In fact, one thing I didn't mention, because I didn't think I had time, is that all of our data sort of culminates in an outcome, right? So our paths, if I go back to the data slide we had, our paths start with some patient characteristics, a sequence of clinical actions, and some patient outcome, right? And so our model understands, by just sort of iterating that process forward, that with this kind of path, this is the kind of outcome I would expect, right? And the outcome obviously is important for your insurance choice, for expenditure. Like these are the things that actually create expenditure. These are the actions that cost something, right? So understanding, the actual process of care is incredibly important for all those applications, right? They're important for decision support tools. They're important for insurance tools. They're important for building. If you want to build a clinical large language model, your clinical large language model should understand this rather than anything else, right? That's the sort of key takeaway.
I was thinking of insurance from the doctor's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, from dealing with the doctors, they're asking for all of these additional tests.
Yeah.
Because they're just trying to cover their ass because they don't want to get sued.
Yeah.
And so if they try them all, that gives them a foundation from which they cannot be challenged on the
Right.
decision.
Well, I think it's...
an informed decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's exciting about here. What is most of the structure is basically a debate over what is clinically relevant.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so as you get richer and richer models that have a nuanced view of clinical relevance, which is to say, you can learn, for example, that what you're ordering right now, it's not that it's the one cookie cutter approach. 95% of doctors would never order this. So we can instantaneously say, look, you shouldn't be ordering this. I think the other piece is this sort of, okay, you can be much smarter about saying there's no plausible, or it's very rare that this is going to be the case. Don't order it because you are covering your ass.
Exactly.
To use the part of my French.
Great question.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, John and Jonas, so much. That was very interesting. Such cutting edge and innovative research. Congratulations. And Jonas, good luck, my friend. Good luck on your research. Wow. That was amazing. I'm just still soaking it all up. But thank you, John and Jonas, very much. Well, we are near the end of our program. We just have one special surprise for you. And I can't think of a better way to conclude today's beautiful luncheon than inviting the California Jazz Choir, who's going to come in and sing a few Cal-spirited songs for us, finishing with Hail to California. And by the way, the lyrics are in the program, which is on your table. So welcome the California Jazz Choir.
Stands our symbol so bold. Big C means to fight and strive and win for blue and gold. Golden Bear is ever watching. Day by day he prowls, and when he hears the tread of lotus and red from his lair, he fiercely growls. Golden Bear, fiercely growls. Golden Bear, fiercely California. Daughters and sons of California, fighting for gold and blue. Palms of glory we will win for alma mater true. Stanford's team will soon be rounded by our dazzling sea. And when we serpentine there, red will turn to green in our hour of victory. Go Bears!
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here today. We're the Cal Jazz Choir, and we have 2 more songs for you. If you like what you hear, feel free to visit Cal Jazz Choir on Instagram, because we have a show tomorrow night. Enjoy. Oh, goodness.
Ba-do-da-da. Ba-ba-da-ba-do-ba-do-ba-do-da. Ba-ba-da-ba-do-da. Ba-dee-da. Da-do-da. Da-do-da. Da-ba-da-ba-da-da-da. Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worries on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear a pitter-pat? And that happy tune is your step. Life can be so sweet on the sunny side of the street.
I used to walk in the shade with those blues on parade, but now I'm not afraid. This rover crossed over.
If I never had a cent, I'd be rich as Rockefeller. Ooh, gold dust at my feet on the sunny side of the street. Ba-doo-da. Ba-doo-da. Ba-ba-way-doo-da. up your hats, coats, boots, everything. Leave your worries on the doorstep, 'cause we're going by and by. Just direct your feet. You look neat on the sunny side of the street. Oh, can't you hear the pitter and the patter of the raindrops trickling down your fire escape ladder? Life can be so fine, fine as California wine. I used to walk in the shade with those blues on parade, but now I'm not afraid. This rover crossed over. If I never had a cent, I'd be rich as Chancellor Lyons, who called dust at my feet. On the sunny, ba-ba-doo-dow, ba-ba-doo-dow. On the shady, ba-ba-doo-dow, ba-ba-doo-dow. On the sunny, sunny side of the street, side of the street. Yeah. Hail to California, alma mater dear. Sing the joyful chorus, sounded far and near. Rallying round her banner, we will never fail. California, alma mater. Hail, hail, hail to